Let's jump now into the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs as it is called in Hebrew, although it's often called the Song of Solomon because it says of Solomon. We'll get to authorship in just a moment. Both of these final two books in our class, the Song of Songs and Lamentations, are often left out of discussions of wisdom literature. Of the books on wisdom literature, many skip over Song of Songs, even Crenshaw, who's often considered as a classic wisdom literature scholar, and even Von Rad, leaving it out of his book on wisdom literature. As we have said early in this class, it's often debated if wisdom literature should even be a category within the Bible. There are just the three sections of the Old Testament, law, prophets, and writings, which is where we find all the wisdom literature. And Song of Songs is not unique in the ancient Near East, but love songs in other cultures, like Egypt, are not typically considered wisdom literature. Those songs are clearly romantic, or in some cases political invectives against some noble or ruler, meant to embarrass the ruler. And those other ancient examples are obviously nowhere near as debated in terms of intent as this book. They are love songs, meant to show, says Garrett, that love is possible in a fallen world. According to Garrett, that is the intent of this song as well, which, as we'll see, is not a universal conclusion, but it would affect how we view this book as wisdom. If it's just a love song, do we consider the book wisdom literature any more than, for instance, Psalm 100? Did the Israelites consider this a wisdom literature book? It's hard to say. We find the Song of Songs right after Ecclesiastes, after other wisdom literature in the English Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, though, Song of Songs comes right before Ecclesiastes and after Ruth, as one of the five megalot, or five little scrolls. Ruth, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Lamentations, Esther. The book of Song of Songs may be close to Ecclesiastes because of its association with Solomon, Ruth being next to Proverbs because of the Proverbs 31 woman, but that may just be coincidence. One would expect Ecclesiastes next to Proverbs. Both are wisdom literature, both are written by Solomon, but they're separated by two books. Maybe Song of Songs is near Ruth because Ruth is a romantic story of sorts. Hard to say why Song of Songs is where it is, and hard to say if Israel really saw this as wisdom literature. However, as we define wisdom in this class as a gift from God, that mind of Christ about how to live in this world, or as one pastor has said, thinking and acting with the mind and heart of God, the Song of Solomon would play a part in that worldview, in that mindset, giving wisdom for how to live in a romantic relationship. While there may be debate, while there may be disagreement among scholars, a document does not have to fall specifically within the genre of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature in order to communicate valuable wisdom to God's people. This book does teach wisdom, even if we were to choose to say it's not an official part of the books known as wisdom literature, even if we were to say that there is no such category. Just as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job are obviously wisdom, this book is maybe less so, and yet there is still much to learn from it. We saw the same with Psalms, that not all the Psalms teach a specific wisdom, so the book is not usually classified as wisdom literature, and yet Psalms teaches us great wisdom, as does the Song of Solomon, which is why we're studying these books in our class. I find it perfectly natural that we should be including, perhaps not on the basis of literary genre studies, but in the very least on the basis of content, this book in wisdom literature. The biggest question related to the Song of Solomon is what point is the book trying to make? And on that there have been many theories. Perhaps the one that arose first, and the one that seems to have become most popular over the centuries, is that this book is an allegory of the love of Christ for the church. Rabbi Akiba, a rabbi early in the 1st century, is perhaps not the first to argue that the book is an allegory, but he is at least the first to have been recorded as considering an allegory. He is reported to have stated, although of course he was speaking in Aramaic or Greek, that had the Torah not been given, Canticles, which is the Latin name for Song of Solomon, Canticles or the Song of Solomon would have sufficed to guide the world. It was Akiba, who was at the Council of Jamnia, who lobbied for the song to be accepted in the Hebrew canon. In fact, the Mishnah records Akiba going so far as to say that it was sinful to use the book at weddings as a mere love song. He declared anathema on those who used the book in this way. Of course, in his view, the book was an allegory of Israel and God. Other commentators, like Hippolytus and Origen, view the book as an allegory of Christ and the church. The problem with allegories is that everything has a meaning, a spiritual meaning. But if that's the case, the graphic sexual language of the Song of Solomon makes us very uncomfortable. Cyril of Alexandria, for instance, said that the Shulamite woman's breasts were the Old Testament and New Testament, with Christ as the small bag of incense hanging between them. I think it's safe to say that this is a bit of a stretch in interpretation, and there are things being done in this book that make us uncomfortable to read, even if this were not an allegory. But the idea that it is an allegory makes us even more uncomfortable. Why portray Christ and the church, or God and Israel, in such graphic sexual language? Not even Ezekiel 16 is this graphic in terms of God's relationship with Israel. And yet there are many who still hold this view. A second option is to see the book not as a strict allegory, but as a type, as a reflection of Christ and the church. This at least somewhat allows us off the hook of having to explain what the spiritual message is behind some of the sexual language, but it still leaves the uncomfortable question of why such sexual language is being used, if what is in mind is the relationship between God and his people. What is more confusing, if that's the right word, or unusual, is that typically when we see typology in the Old Testament, we see some connection made explicit in the New Testament. And yet the only mention of Song of Solomon that we ever see in the New Testament is the fact that several marriage feasts are used as parables in the teaching of Jesus. Jesus himself goes to a wedding feast. He's called the bride of Christ, is the church. And those who hold on to this book of the Bible as a type often dismiss the majority of real-world application of this book in order to talk about Christ and the church, because it's assumed that ultimately that's the point. James Hamilton recently wrote a book called A Biblical, Theological, Allegorical, Christological Interpretation of Song of Solomon. And in that book, he does pretty much ignore, or at the very least only mention, the natural interpretation, the relationship between Solomon and the Shulamite woman. That's the drawback. Sure, if it's not allegorical, we aren't trying to spiritualize sexual phrases, but we have the book largely about an idea then that is never mentioned or discussed. It talks about sexuality, and yet we never talk about that. I'll come back to that in just a moment. A third option is to see the book only about human sexuality, human relationships. This is the natural view and has become, in many ways, the most popular way of looking at the book, although lately I seem to be coming across more and more people who take option 2. Daniel Estes holds to this view. However, we need to be careful with this view. The vast weight of church history has seen Song of Solomon as having a spiritual message. Typological readings take this reading a little too far, trying to draw a connection between the book and Christ and the church, but the natural view can take interpretation too far away the other way, of eliminating any allusion to Christ. A balanced middle has been attempted by several scholars, including Ian Duguid, in his commentary on the Song of Solomon in the Reformed Expository Commentary series, who tries to focus on the book's application to human relationships, as well as seeing what the book says about the relationship with Christ and the church. Duguid is well-intentioned, but he leaves the door open perhaps just a little too much to the Christological interpretation, so that the natural emphasis upon marital sexuality is minimized. That's not to say, though, that we should eliminate all Christological interpretation, because there is a Christological interpretation to this book. However, and this is where scholars and readers alike have difficulties, if we understand the relationship between Christ and his church as that perfect relationship, that perfect marriage, the marriage to which all marriage points, then really the loving marriage in the Song of Solomon is no different than any other marriage relationship in the Old Testament, either for good or evil. It points us to Christ. Consider the example of Sarah, held up by Peter in 1 Peter 3, as the behavior of all women, all wives, and yet the complete idiot that Abraham was in that same situation, not to be emulated by men or husbands. And yet 1 Peter 3 is similar in some regard to Ephesians 5, a passage on human marriage, but also divine marriage, where we rejoice that Christ is not the failure of a husband that Abraham was, and where we understand that we are to submit to Christ as Sarah submitted to her moron of a husband. Really, we even learn something about this spiritual marriage between Christ and his church from stories about Isaac and Rebekah, Boaz and Ruth, Adam and Eve, obviously, but that does not require that we interpret any of those stories typologically. Instead, if I can borrow the phraseology of O. Palmer Robertson, we interpret the stories redemptive historically. Man and women, Adam and Eve, were themselves created, in history, with a historical marriage to reflect the spiritual relationship of God and his people. Paul makes the connection between human marriage and spiritual marriage explicit, saying that the end of Genesis 2, a man leaving his father and mother being united to his wife and the two becoming one flesh, was ultimately about spiritual marriage between Christ and his church. But Paul is not inventing theology here. God uses the same motif and theme of marriage in Ezekiel 16 and other places in the Old Testament. Hosea, obviously, where he's told to have a marriage that would serve as a reflection of God's relationship with Israel, an idea that we understood because the theological concept already existed in Scripture. This theme of marriage as a pointer to Christ and the church, God and Israel, is found throughout the Old Testament. But through sin, the man and the women had their eyes opened, and suddenly their perfect relationship was full of shame. Sin severed their relationship with God and with one another. Now there was a need for redemption. This is where Christ obviously plays such a crucial role, dying for his bride. But it's because of our spiritual union with Christ that our physical marriages, our physical union with our spouses, are transformed. We can correctly say that just as human marriage points to spiritual marriage, it is from the power and the grace of that spiritual marriage that we can get humanly married. All of Scripture is really a restoration, a redemption of those two great relationships destroyed in Genesis 3. Human relationships on the horizontal, spiritual relationships on the vertical. We see the brokenness of human marriage from Genesis to the end of the New Testament, but we also see the restoration of marriage from Genesis to the end of the New Testament, where we see God impacting marriage, restoring the picture that was instilled in marriage in the Garden of Eden. Whether good marriage or bad, the marriages in the Old Testament teach us about human marriage and give us joy that our spiritual spouse is nothing like our physical spouse. So we can say that the marriage in Song of Solomon points to Christ and the church, as does any other marriage in the Bible. Some marriages in the Bible do a better job of pointing than others, but in fact, this book is really the ideal, so that rather than directly, as with any part of the law, we see a reference to marriage between Christ and the church, we are seeing it indirectly. As we compare our marriage to this one, the book, like any other part of the law, points us to our failure so that we see our need for a Messiah to redeem our marriages and to be our perfect spouse. In that way, like any other marriage passage, we are pointed to the marriage of Christ and the church, not explicitly, like Ephesians 5, but indirectly through the law. There is another option of interpretation, and that is that the Song of Solomon is a political invective against Solomon. This argument has been put forth by Nogel and Rendsburg as it relates to other such poetry of the ancient Near East, specifically the Hijah or the Tashvib poetic genres, that the Song of Solomon is a critique, a ridicule, a sexually explicit, humiliating ridicule, a mockery of Solomon, written by someone after the split from Rehoboam in the southern kingdom. On a purely linguistic level, a purely cultural level, the argument actually makes sense and fits with other similar phenomenon. The problem is this doesn't jive with the biblical data, and we would be left wondering why in the world anyone would ever accept a book into the Bible if it was meant to mock Solomon and embarrass him. The only explanation would be that thousands of generations have been too stupid to see the book as mocking Solomon rather than praising him, and that everyone has been misguided in thinking that it was written by Solomon to teach about wisdom and marriage. And yet it's a view that the Society of Biblical Literature has published, so they at least view our stupidity as an option, unsurprisingly. Really, the best way of looking at the book is the redemptive historical method. It's about a human relationship, but because of the nature of all human marriages, the book is naturally about the relationship between Christ and the church. Although that's not the main point. The main point is really how we're to have a heart of wisdom in our human marriages because of our relationship with Christ. This book is the epitome of human marriage, of what a loving marital relationship looks like, at least in part, as we'll see in just a moment. Before we go on, we're faced with the question of authorship. As for the author, this is the only book of all the ones we looked at where I'm really not fully convinced that Solomon wrote it. Dwayne Garrett makes a good argument for seeing the book written during the reign of Solomon, but by someone other than Solomon, with Solomon as the ideal husband. That fits the text well. As with every book we've looked at in the wisdom literature, there is debate of authorship. Solomon's name is listed at the beginning, although with a relative pronoun, which is odd and seemingly unnecessary, not just of Solomon, but which is of Solomon or even attributed to Solomon. The book could theoretically be written to Solomon about Solomon in a Solomonic style. I like Garrett's statement that it's at least written by someone that knew Solomon when Solomon was king. There are the typical arguments against this suggestion, of course, Aramaisms and the like, arguments that can be fairly easily dismissed. O. Palmer Robertson, in his book Christ of Wisdom, does a good job poking holes in the arguments that have been made against Solomonic authorship, and I'd refer you there for the full debate. There's also a question of whether or not the woman in this story is real, if either of the characters are real. since we're never told of Solomon and the Shulamite woman anywhere else in Scripture. Although I would suspect that when a man has 700 wives, you don't really spend that much time talking about his relationship with the sheepherder's daughter. What is noteworthy is that this book is written as if there are no other women in Solomon's life, as though she's the only one. You could argue that the other 699 were just political marriages and that this is the woman that he loved, but it is at least noteworthy that Solomon himself, or someone perhaps in Solomon's royal court, portrays this book as though this woman is the only one and there are no others, which, historically, there were many others. But it is certainly possible that Solomon began to realize that having one wife was better than many, and whoever wrote this book realized that life was better with just one wife. However, there is nothing per se in this book that would make us think that she doesn't actually exist. On the other hand, this book in particular loses nothing, much like the book of Job that we looked at the beginning of the semester, if the woman is not real but a creation of the author. Some scholars have pointed out that Solomon, which in Hebrew is Shlomo, is very similar to Shulami. Deliberate? Hard to say. On an emotional level, yes, this book makes a powerful statement if she is real, just as the book of Job is more powerful as he is real. But it's at least possible, and there are many scholars, including Garrett, that take it this way, that someone is writing an idealized story about Solomon in the time of Solomon, perhaps even about a real woman that the author knew was involved with Solomon, but also about an idealized woman. If Solomon himself is writing, I would also argue that this woman is real as well, not just a figment of Solomon's imagination. He isn't attempting to personify wisdom here like King Lemuel's mother in Proverbs 31, encapsulating her as a possible real person, but the Shulamite woman who is real. But it's at least an interpretive option that this idealized love story involves idealized characters who may not actually exist. This book, in my opinion, following Estes, is not simply a collection of love poems, but a linear story. There's a progression that takes place here. A longing, a wooing, a consummation, and then real-life problems. The progression is just too strong to say that the book is simply a collection of love poems and that there's coincidentally a story, although there are many who take it this way. Even Dwayne Garrett leaves that option open. Alden found a chiastic parallelism in the book based upon repeated phrases. Finally, one more question, and I mention it simply because some scholars still argue about how many characters there are in the story. Some will still occasionally say that there are 3 characters, which is put forward by Bullock, the Shulamite, her lover, and Solomon, and that Solomon is perhaps trying to steal the Shulamite woman from her lover, albeit unsuccessfully. But the best reading is that there are 2 principal characters, Solomon and the Shulamite. There are other random characters, of course, the Shulamite's brothers near the end of the books, the other daughters of Jerusalem, etc., but 2 main characters. So now that we've dealt with how many characters are in the book, what's the point? Well, the book simply teaches us wisdom about our marriages and how we are to be wise as married people. In that sense, Song of Solomon is an elevated, lofted, exalted love song extolling the beauty, in fact the virtue, of monogamous marriage. In that sense, the book is not all that different from the opening chapters of Proverbs, especially Proverbs 1 through 9 and Proverbs 31. The difference is that with Proverbs teaches us didactically, with an appeal of the father to the son, Song of Solomon teaches us by example. The father in Proverbs said, "Delight in the wife of your youth," Proverbs 5:18. Song of Solomon shows that delight. There's no explicit reference to escaping the woman folly, as in Proverbs 1:2-9, although there is one refrain of wisdom that occurs repeatedly throughout the Song of Solomon that could be taken as a command to avoid folly. It's repeated 3 times, actually. Do not stir up or awaken love until it pleases. Chapter 2, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 8, verse 4. That word for pleases is the word desires, translated by the NIV as until it so desires. The idea is that love is not something you rush into, not something to engage in until the right time, which in the context of this book is in marriage. Thus, says Garrett, this book rejects both debauchery on the one hand, but asceticism on the other. You can see the progression in this book in the structure. The courtship is in chapters 1 through 3. The wedding takes place in chapter 4. Chapter 5 to the end deal with real-life intimacy issues. The proper place for love, at least sexual love, then, is after the wedding of chapter 4. Bullock follows Ginsburg and divides it up further. Chapter 1 through 2:7, 2:8 through 3:5, 3:6 through 5:1, 5:2 to 8:4, 8:5 to the end. This division breaks after each repetition of the refrain, "Do not awaken love," in 2:7-3:5, the wedding up to point 5:1, and then the refrain again in chapter 8, verse 4. Again, proper love is in marriage is the key point. One of the fascinating aspects of this book is that the woman does more talking than the man. One would expect that since Solomon is the man and seems to either be giving this book as instructions in marriage and not just as love songs, or the fact that he's the ideal husband, that he would do most of the talking. Instead, though, the Shulamite woman talks twice as much as he does, twice as many verses. Maybe that is suggesting that the ideal husband keeps his mouth shut. But this is part of what has given rise to the idea that since Solomon is the hero of the story, that he's in focus, and that we are seeing in this book is the woman's desire for her husband, just as the churches desire Christ and long for and want him and be with him, that Christ is to be our focus. Of course, as we've already seen, that gets twisted when we look at what the woman wants from Solomon. But on the other hand, if we consider that Solomon is the ideal husband, then in many ways it makes sense that the woman would do most of the talking. In fact, it would make this book somewhat unique, and why it's been subjected to so many so-called feminist readings. There isn't really a need for a feminist reading. Instead, what we have is a series of love songs demonstrating the value of this woman, which demonstrates the value of women in marriage. As one commentator says, this couple is at least equal in love. They love each other, both of them. This isn't one-sided. This isn't the violation and oppression of one by the other. This book portrays a two-sided relationship, emphasizing a woman's emotions and feelings in an era when that was not always done. I have no contextual reason to say this, but it is certainly possible, it should not be dismissed out of hand, that the woman could be the author of the book, writing an ode to Solomon. We don't know that she's the author, but we don't know that she's not either, which makes this book, again, unique, but well in keeping with the woman who wrote Proverbs 31, King Lemuel's mother. In fact, maybe the Shulamite is King Lemuel's mother. Okay, now I've really gone off the deep end. No way to prove any of that. Suffice to say that the woman, the Shulamite, plays such a large part in this book that she's elevated to the level of Solomon. Now Solomon, we understand as elevated. He is, after all, the king and the focus of the woman's desire. And so we're not surprised then to read things like chapter 3, verses 6 through 10. What we do find odd, or should find odd, is Solomon's description of her, as she describes herself in chapter 1, dark and lovely as the daughter of Jerusalem. She talks about the fact that she has somewhat neglected herself. We remember, though, that she didn't take care of herself because she was out working. This is an industrious woman like Proverbs 31. Not a royal woman, she's a sheepherder's daughter, lived among the sheep out in the open. Not clothed in the riches of the courts, she's clothed in working garments. Not perfumed, although we do read later of a bag of perfume that she wears. I would assume that she wears it because she smells like sheep, like it has been too long since she took a bath. She doesn't live in the palace courts where she can bathe every day. She lives in the fields and bathes when she can, which probably isn't often. Why do brides carry flowers? Because it used to be when people were getting married in centuries gone by, the brides didn't smell so great. And flowers covered the smell. This woman smells. She's dirty. She's overtanned. She's sunburnt. She's not fit for a king. And yet what do people call her in verse 8? The most beautiful of women. Why? Because that's what Solomon calls her in verse 15. Oh, how beautiful you are. Now, she said in verse 5 that she was lovely, but Solomon doesn't say lovely. He says most beautiful. In fact, he goes on to describe her, especially in chapter 4, in some of the most exalted language here in the book. This is exalted, idealized language, pure and simple, exaggerated, hyperbolic, ideal, the perfect woman, a perfect 10. Has Solomon been drinking too much when he sees this woman? Actually, I would suggest to you that Solomon is setting an example for men, just as the Shulamite woman is setting an example for all wives. This is the attitude we're supposed to have towards our spouses, that they are physically without flaw. Consider the fact that as we age, we get old, we get fat, things wear out, fall out, begin to appear in places that they should not. Our bodies wrinkle and simply over time wear out. Now we can do all sorts of things to prevent that process, but eventually it's going to catch up with us. Supposedly our bodies develop until we're 25, and from there it's downhill, either slowly or fast. And assuming we're going to be married until old age, eventually the person we're married to will no longer look like the physical specimen they were when we married them. The same is certainly true of Solomon's love. This Shulamite woman, she's neglected herself, she admits, but still, in the eyes of Solomon, she's beautiful. Solomon continues in chapter 6 by saying, "You are beautiful as Tirzah, my darling, as lovely as Jerusalem, as majestic as troops with banners." Just a quick note, Tirzah was a principal city of the north, replaced by Omri with Samaria. The fact that Tirzah is set opposite Jerusalem parallel here gives weight to the dating of this book at the time of Solomon, or shortly thereafter. He says, "Turn your eyes from me, they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of goats descending from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of sheep. Each has its twin. Your temples behind your veil are like the halves of a pomegranate." Solomon seems to be running out of metaphors because he begins repeating himself. My wife probably wouldn't tolerate that lack of creativity, but apparently the Shulamite is okay with it. But then look at what Solomon says in verse 8 of chapter 6. 60 queens there may be, and 80 concubines, virgins beyond number. But my dove, my perfect one, is unique, the only daughter of her mother, the favorite of the one who bore her. The young women shall call her, and call her blessed. The queens and concubines praise her. Here we have a hint that there may have been other women, and yet Solomon makes it clear that he only has eyes for one. There are virgins beyond number. Solomon could have had any woman he wanted, any number of women he wanted. He took as many as he wanted, and yet the only one that he wants, apparently, the only one that he sees is the Shulamite. Despite her dark skin, despite the fact that she probably smelled like sheep, despite her age, he sees her without flaw. She's the only one he sees, even if there are 60 queens. In chapter 2, Solomon also calls her the lily among thorns. She says, "I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valley." Rose isn't the best translation, better a tulip or a hyacinth or a crocus. Sharon is a coastal plain between Caesarea and Joppa, but the fact that the Shulamite is a lily among thorns means the rest are to be ignored. In fact, I had a professor, Dr. Van Gemeren, who named his daughter Shoshana, the Hebrew word for lily. When she got married, Dr. Van Gemeren did her wedding and went down the line of bridesmaids and pointed them all out to Shoshana's husband, whom I believe was named Scott. Dr. Van Gemeren pointed at each bridesmaid and said, "Scott, she's a thorn. She's a thorn. She's a thorn." But when he came to Shoshana, he said, "She's your lily." That's what Solomon is saying here. He has eyes only for the Shulamite. She's the only lily among thorns, the only one for him. And as such, he holds her in an exalted, idealized perspective that sees her without faults. Indeed, we might remember 1 Peter 4:8, that love covers a multitude of faults. This is the viewpoint we have with one another, and in my opinion, this is the very foundation of the book's relational advice. We have to keep in mind, as the couple faces real-life crises in the end of the book, that they love each other. Chapters 5 and 6 is a common scenario. Solomon wants to be intimate. His wife has a headache, so she says no. So he leaves, and then she wants him back. The friends challenge her, "Do you really want him back?" So in chapter 6 he says, "I told you so. Forget it. You had your chance. I'm never coming back." No, actually, that's not what he says at all. He says, "All is forgiven." The second real scenario is purely sexual. I know that it might be mixed company that's listening to these lectures, but it simply is. The point of chapter 7 is that sex is not just for marriage, it is to be enjoyed only in marriage, in that security. Let me explain that again. Sex doesn't just belong in marriage, it is enjoyed in marriage. See chapter 7, verse 10 especially. "I am his, and his desire is for me." Complete intimacy. This is as close as we get to, "and they knew no shame." That might be why the word there for desire is the same word as Genesis 3:16, "Your desire shall be for your husband," which in Genesis 3:16 was a negative. In fact, the first part of chapter 8 is a desire for public displays of affection, which was acceptable among family members, but not lovers, not even spouses in the ancient world. And yet in chapter 8, verses 5 through 7, we see love and intimacy displayed, and not just displayed, but we see intimacy in old age, the emphasis upon leaning. Even old age cannot sweep away love. "Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, its jealousy unyielding as the grave." Verse 8 to the end talks about family and nurture, from the protection of the brothers to the protection of a husband. The brothers talk about the woman, and then at the end, we see the Solomon, or the kingly figure, the husband. He's the one who begins to talk about protecting her. And then finally, we end with a romantic call. The man says, "You who dwell in the gardens with friends in attendance, let me hear your voice." She says, "Come away, my beloved, and be like a gazelle, or like a young stag on the spice-laden mountains." What we see in the book of Solomon is really the wisdom within marital sexuality, the wisdom within a marriage relationship. We see them struggle with real issues, both as it relates to their relationship and as it relates to their intimacy. We see the progression of them wanting each other, desiring each other, and yet actually getting married, and then seeing sexuality then in the context of that marriage. So really, this is an emphatic statement upon the fact that marriage is important. It's important to God, and it's important in Israel. It's important in our lives, and the wisdom of Song of Solomon certainly applies.